So, Craig, there was a fairly substantial and long-waited court case over the past couple of weeks that stems from a much anticipated, very controversial in terms of pushback, and one of probably the best examples of activism fundamentally changing government policy. And that decision was a FCC decision in the way that they classify internet service. And ultimately, this is all about net neutrality. But walk us back to that decision a couple of years ago to set up what the implications of this court case were this week or two ago.
Sure. And thanks for having me on. This is really the culmination of a 10-year fight over the issue of net neutrality that's been heavily focused at the Federal Communications Commission over the last couple of years. And in February 2015, the FCC moved finally to create meaningful, real net neutrality rules to protect the free and open internet and how it works, and did restore their authority under the law, authority that had been abdicated all the way back in the Bush administration, to actually step in when phone or cable companies were interfering with your internet connection or messing with your content online. This has been a controversy inside Washington, although one that really saw the Federal Communications Commission finally reverse course and take a really strong public interest position, which they finally got to in the spring of 2015. And then immediately, like everything good that happens at the Federal Communications Commission, they were sued by the cable and phone companies who took the case to the Federal Appeals Court, which heard arguments last December. And just a few days ago, the Federal Appeals Court ruled in favor of the FCC, as well as groups like FreePress that intervened on behalf of the FCC, to say no, the FCC did do the right thing. They do have the authority to make this kind of decision, and they completely, threw out all of the industry arguments. It was really a resounding defeat for the phone and cable companies that had twice sued before to overturn FCC rules on net neutrality, and a big win for the open internet.
Yeah, okay. So now let's, before we talk about the implications of the ruling, let's go back, because this story is really an amazing story from a bunch of different angles, ranging, and there are so many different issues that implicated this one issue of net neutrality, ranging from the implications of the Senate changing their rules and not allowing filibusters on judicial appointments because it was the D.C. Circuit Court which held this ruling, to the functioning of agencies, to overcoming an industry lobbyist and what his inclinations may have been. There's a lot of different stories that are wound up in this. So let's go back to the early aughts, if we can,
Sure.
Before the internet. Back in we had, of course, the tech bubble in the late 90s, but the internet, and I don't know if people remember this, but in 2002 there was no YouTube. There was no Huffington Post. There was no
Facebook.
Yeah, there was no Facebook. There was no really concept of social media per se. And the Bush administration changed something about the way that we perceived as a society the internet. Tell us about that decision.
Yeah, so basically what happened is you can go all the way back to 1996, which is the last time the Communications Act, our nation's communications laws, were updated. And they actually didn't do it. The internet was only mentioned like 11 times, but they actually didn't do a bad job of setting policy on the right path. But in doing so, industry then tried to whittle away at the good policies that were made in the 90s. And so some of your listeners might be able to go all the way back to the days of dial-up and be able to remember that, while certainly we wouldn't want to go back to the days of dial-up in terms of speed and service, in terms of competition, it was really pretty amazing.
Yep.
Because you had one line going into your house and a bunch of different people competing to offer you service, AOL and Earthlink and the phone company and local providers. And you had a lot of choice and competition, and this amazing thing happened. prices actually went down. there was a competitive market. When broadband started to get developed, and the cable companies were going to get into the internet business, they didn't want to be beholden to any of those rules, so-called common carrier rules, that said, hey, there's one line going into your house, but you got to offer wholesale rates and have competition. Because cable had always been this one-way, essentially broadcast model where they got to decide what channels you got, what kind of service, and control everything. So they wanted to take broadband and, frankly, turn it into something that looks like cable television. And that vision of theirs hasn't really changed. So they went to the Bush administration and to the FCC, then run by a guy named Michael Powell, son of Colin Powell, who was the FCC chair, and they said, "Hey, we don't want to have any of these rules." And the Bush FCC said, "Okay, well, we'll just change how broadband is classified, and instead of treating it as what it obviously is, a telecommunication service, which is just a fancy way of saying a two-way communication service. You can upload and download, you can talk to each other. We're going to call broadband an information service and kind of bundle it in with the part of the law meant to apply to websites and services and LexisNexis and content,
right.
Not infrastructure, not pipes." So they made this change, and they did some hand-waving saying, "Oh, we'll still be able to step in if there's a problem, don't worry about it." And eventually there was a big court case that went all the way to the Supreme Court called the Brand X case in 2005 because a company sued saying, wait a minute, the FCC can't do this. And what the Supreme Court ultimately ruled was the FCC is the expert agency. It's up to them. They get to decide. So suddenly, cable broadband internet service was no longer a telecommunications service, and if the cable companies believed they didn't have any of those obligations, as soon as they got out from under this law, the phone companies went to the FCC and said, hey, we don't want these obligations either, and the FCC said, okay, you don't have them either. And about this point, all of a sudden, the big executives at AT&T and Verizon and elsewhere started talking about how these were their pipes and Google wasn't going to be able to ride them for free anymore, and they should be able to do all these things. And that's where this issue of net neutrality first emerged in response to what these companies said they were going to do, how they were going to discriminate and start changing the way the internet worked. And that's when net neutrality first really became an issue, 2005, 2006, actually having a lot to do with the rise of the netroots and the blogosphere and all this amazing, the birth of content. This is still kind of pre-social media, but people
right.
were using the power of the internet to tell their own stories. I mean, really, this coincided in a lot of ways with the growth of YouTube, the birth of YouTube, back in the days when anybody could frankly get their YouTube video on the front of the site. And we saw this, real awakening that only grew over the sort of subsequent 10 years. And there were a couple waves of this fight that went on to try to protect net neutrality under the law. Sort of famously, the late Ted Stevens, went on the floor of the Congress and called the internet a series of tubes,
right.
and sort of showed how out of touch Congress was. That was sort of phase one of the fight, where they were unable to pass bad legislation, but it was still kind of in limbo. Candidate Obama came in, said he was for net neutrality, but in the first term didn't really do a lot to protect it, and really sort of got steamrolled by the phone and cable companies who
Well, let me talk about that first term, because one of the attempts was to sort of go halfway, where the FCC would issue regulations about net neutrality, but without changing the classification back to being a common carrier. And that stuff was taken to court by, of course, I think it was Verizon took it to court. And Verizon won because the FCC was sort of being mealy-mouthed about it. They had one of two choices. One is you reclassify them as a common carrier, and then you have all sorts of ability to regulate this because of its relevance to American citizens, or you don't classify it that way and you don't have the ability to regulate it in the way you want. And so the FCC was put on the hot seat as to whether or not they would do this. And that takes us up to that big battle with the current FCC chairman, Tom Wheeler. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about that battle. So, Craig, when we broke, we were about to discuss the battle that took place to convince Tom Wheeler and the FCC in the second term of the Obama administration to reclassify the internet as a telecommunication service, which the courts had basically told the FCC that's the only way that you can really enforce net neutrality. And if you do that, you can enforce net neutrality. You can say this is basically this is almost akin to a right, that Americans have, is to having access to that. And so Tom Wheeler was hesitant to do it, but then at one point President Obama came out after immense pressure and showed that he favored net neutrality.
Right. I mean, and that's really the story here is the political movement on that. Tom Wheeler, the chairman of the FCC, is a guy. He was, the first Obama FCC chairman. Frankly, was largely a failure. Tom Wheeler was brought in, a former industry bigwig. He used to head the cable lobby. He used to head the cell phone lobby. A lot of us in the public interest community were really skeptical of this guy, but he was a big Obama supporter. He came in. He got appointed to the job. Really almost the first big thing that landed on his desk was this net neutrality case. The Federal Appeals Court threw out the FCC's last sort of half-measure attempt at making net neutrality rules after a challenge from Verizon. It was kicked back to the FCC, and in the early going, Tom Wheeler indicated he didn't really want anything to do with this. They were looking for a compromise, which is really sort of like a compromise on a capitulation.
Right.
All these sort of half measures and hybrid proposals that got as far as being proposed by the FCC actually in a proposed rulemaking, and you saw this onslaught of opposition. Now, we'd been building for a long time. This spiked in 2006, 2007, but by 2014, you had that many more people who really cared about the internet, understood the internet, and the FCC was frankly overwhelmed by public opposition. 4 million people sent comments to the FCC. The FCC didn't know 4 million people knew what the FCC was.
Right.
So they'd never seen anything like it. There were people occupying the FCC, camping outside, big protests, giant billboards that we wheeled in, broadcasting, John Oliver's commentary on net neutrality and other things that went on. A ton of really exciting activism, frankly, around the internet, online and off. That put the FCC under a lot of pressure, but they were still resisting, still trying to kind of push a compromise. At this point, the Obama administration, which had a lot to say back in 2007 on the campaign trail, President Obama, but really hadn't gotten involved in these debates, did step in. I think there were a lot of reasons for it. One of them was the big Democratic losses in the 2014 midterms. They came out of those, and I think it finally, a little later than maybe some of us would have liked, but really woke up the Obama administration to like, hey, this middle road, this compromise path isn't working.
Not getting you anywhere.
They saw that the Netroots was really engaged on this issue.
Right.
Daily Kos and Color of Change and all the other groups that Fight for the Future, Demand Progress, that have been organizing on this issue. And it was really the first thing that the Obama administration came out with after the midterm, saying, you know what? Actually, I've said this all along. We want the strongest possible protection. So it was that public pressure got to work on Obama. That created a whole big political opening and really kind of completed. The FCC was moving in a better direction, but this gave them the political space to do it. And suddenly you had them completely reversing course, making the strongest rules and doing that key thing you were talking about before, the reclassifying broadband under Title II.
So they reclassify broadband, and there's an anticipation. There's going to be court cases. It's going to be wrapped up for years and years. And the sort of the side story to this had been a couple of years earlier, the democratically controlled Senate at the time made a deal basically to get rid of the filibuster for judicial appointments below the Supreme Court. And the D.C. Circuit Court, which deals with all of these questions as to whether or not a regulatory agency has certain authorities, was operating with less than its full complement of judges. President Obama's nominees got appointed and confirmed because there was no filibuster for these things. And thus, when this case gets to the D.C. Circuit Court, there are people there who are amenable to the idea that government can make rules and laws, particularly if they had them 15 years earlier. Then from there, we move on. So give us a sense now, what is the import of this ruling, both in terms of net neutrality? Is it over at this point? And then beyond that, what does it say about where people can go and push this principle that high-speed internet, that quality internet is something that Americans deserve rather than are privileged to get by a private company.
Yeah, well, yeah, there's a lot there, but I think that there really are a lot of important lessons here, and this was a very winnable case for the FCC, maybe whoever the judges were, but it certainly helped. And the thing is, this is why these phone and cable companies were fighting this so-called reclassification so hard. Is that they're ultimately were afraid of just the agency having the authority to step in when they do something wrong, and they want to be able to be gatekeepers. They want to keep being able to change the playing field, change the rules. And what Title II allows the FCC to do is actually adjust to new technologies, adjust to new schemes where they might be doing something wrong, whether that has to do with privacy, whether that's blocking or throttling the internet, whether that's all kinds of things that these companies might do to interfere with your internet experience. Title II just says, hey, it's the FCC's job to be the cop on the beat here and step in if they have to. And that threat of stepping in is almost as good as them actually stepping in. So that's a huge win. Just in general, it's why these companies fought it so hard. I think, this whole fight too has been a generational shift. We've seen, people who, were coming of age when we were talking about this in 2005, 2006, now being politically engaged, active folks in 2014, 2015. And it's true for the judiciary too. So Judge Srinivasan, who was one of those Obama appointees who did actually hear this case, I'd like to think a lot of the judges would have seen the wisdom of the FCC's arguments here. But what was very clear from his participation is that, he used the internet. He was asking common sense questions about, why should his internet connection be different if it's his, wired connection to his computer or his iPad. It just shouldn't be, just these common sense, obvious things that weren't allowing the industry to tie it in knots and, just confuse matters. So I think there's kind of a huge lesson there, as well as a lesson, to regulators and to future administrations about like what happens when you actually stick to your guns, and that the people will actually step up and be on your side. Tom Wheeler eventually called this the proudest public policy day of his life. The FCC meeting where these rules were voted on was interrupted by like 6 standing ovations. That's not business as usual at the FCC. And so instead of trying to like compromise and telling all these activists and advocates, this compromise is the best you can get, actually standing up for some principles goes a long way. And I think going forward, this does give the FCC the authority to step in if they need to, and to deal with things like broadband competition. How are we going to lower the price of broadband? That's a huge issue. That's what's keeping people from being online. How are we going to encourage new forms of entrepreneurship and innovation, where you don't have to go to Comcast or AT&T or Verizon for permission to have a really cool website, app, service, a bunch of stuff I haven't even dreamed up yet. And those are going to be big fights, and they're going to be big fights with Google and Facebook too, frankly, as they try to dominate their space. But I think, this shows how public policy can actually be used to stand up to these gatekeepers, to kind of, hit them in ways that really matter by making them accountable to, another big force, which is the government. I don't want the government to control or run the internet, but I don't want these corporate guys to do it either. I want a balance between the two, and engaging in these kind of public policy battles are really the only way to get there.
Craig Aaron, thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.